For this panel, we'll actually address what women actually want from their employers and the policies that are most impactful for actually retaining women and helping them realize their goals. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce the panel. We have Viola Olayinka. We have Michelle Leahy, Jenni Snyder, and Aisha Ferrazares. Sorry. Thank you.
So much.
Let me come up. Sorry.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We're really excited to have a panel of fantastic women technologists here to tell you a little bit about kind of what women are looking for in the workplace and how we can build more inclusive cultures. I'm Michelle Leahy from AnitaB.org, and I'm going to give our panelists a chance to introduce themselves.
So, hi, my name is Jenni Snyder, and I'm an engineering manager.
My name is Aisha. Oh, that was loud. Aisha Ferrazares, and I'm a software engineer.
My name is Viola Olayinka. I work in product operations at Twilio, but I was a software engineering fellow at Hackbright Academy.
Great. So I'm going to start off by asking you, Jenni. Yelp has some great groups such as Awesome Women Engineering and Yelp Moms. How does these groups really help raise up issues affecting these communities, and how can you work with leadership to make sure they actually get addressed?
Sure. So I think the number one importance of employee resource groups, especially when they're first getting off the ground, is to provide a place for people who may feel alone or not included, give them the space to share their experiences, get validation, hear maybe coping strategies that other members of their organization have recommended or their experiences. And then, of course, some employee resource groups might have as part of their mission providing, feedback to the larger organization and suggestions around how the organization can be made more inclusive. When that happens, of course, sometimes there is opposition, and in those particular situations, it's really, seek out allies, find people who have more power in the organization and asking them to kind of amplify your message and feedback, or figuring out what is the opposition to making an organization more inclusive and then trying to pick away at that.
Great. Yeah, I know that can happen in small increments, but as you move forward, you can really make a big change. Great. Aisha, I wanted to ask you a little bit about kind of how many mentors you may have had in your experience, how you found positive mentors, and maybe some of the best advice you've gotten over the years.
So I think I've been very lucky that Dropbox has a one-on-one mentorship program that's actually built up pretty well. So I was able to get a mentor officially through this program when I was a new grad. And I've also had other mentors for different types of skills. So there's a whole mentorship framework that can be really helpful to help structure these discussions and figure out what sort of mentorship are you looking for. Are you looking for career mentorship? Are you looking for technical mentorship? What sort of mentorship are you looking for, and then finding someone who has those skills that you want to develop. So I was lucky to have the new grad mentor. I've also been mentored by the tech leads on my teams who've helped me grow technically. And I've also been participating, there's a new program called Ascent that I've been participating in, which helps you find external mentors. And so I've also had a mentor through that, which has been fantastic. So there are lots of programs out there, and even when your company doesn't have one, there are often external programs that can help you find mentorship. I've also made a lot of fantastic relationships just through friends. So I've asked my manager, asked other friends I know in the industry to connect me with people, and I have been connected with some really awesome women at other companies as well through those relationships.
Fantastic. Yeah, it seems like a really great opportunity to see you have so much support internally, but also building a strong external network. Viola, I'd like to ask you a little bit about your experience with Hackbright, going through a program that really is dedicated to women technologists. How has that impacted you in ways that you may not have had those experiences through a co-ed program?
Sure. So the beauty about Hackbright is that it attracts a lot of ambitious, driven women who are not afraid to dispel whatever rumor or whatever myth they might have had in their mind prior to learning how to code. And so Hackbright just provides this community of supportive, ambitious women who are not afraid to say that I don't have all the answers, but I'm willing and determined to find out what the answer is. And so Hackbright has just been such a a support system for me, especially in my career. There's so many women that I could lean on as an advocate or a role model or a mentor, someone that could just help me tease out some of the questions that I might have of how to handle certain questions or how to handle certain situations in the workplace. I can always look back to that community of women that I went through 12 weeks of intensive studying with, and we are just always cheering each other on or rooting each other on and reminding each other that, hey, you can do this, you're okay, it's not as scary as it seems.
Fantastic. It sounds like that's able to provide you with a really great support network. So now I'd kind of like to open it up with questions for all of you to just have a discussion around. We do know that women can sometimes be penalized when they advocate for themselves in the workplace. So I was wondering if you guys have seen any things companies can do to really empower women to ask for what they need to be successful in the workplace.
Sure, I can go first. I think, so Awesome Women in Engineering at Yelp is inclusive to allies as well, and we have programming for allies as well as women. One of our most successful programs for allies has been an ally skills workshop led by Valerie Aurora, formerly of the ADA Initiative and later Frameshift Consulting. It's a workshop that trains allies to stick up and maybe advocate for women in the workplace where they would traditionally be penalized, because it's shown that where women or marginalized groups might be penalized for sticking up for themselves, people in the dominant paradigm won't be in the same way. It's very safe for them to do that. Another thing that we try and do is raise the issues that women in engineering and other groups face with line managers so that managers can help shape that culture, help make a more inclusive place, and generally be the supportive where women might not feel safe to do so.
One thing I've also seen be really helpful is having pretty obvious frameworks for how you get those opportunities that you're looking for. So one thing I had noticed is in our women in engineering group, we had a conversation about women moving into technical leadership. And I looked at this document that we had that said what the roles of a tech lead are, and we walked through it together, and we actually said, look, here are the things that we're already doing, and then we had that framework to bring to our managers to say, hey, I'm doing these things. I would like this title because I think that I would do a good job at it. And those frameworks were really helpful for making us realize that what we were doing was actually deserving of a new role or a new set of responsibilities.
I think also the frameworks are pretty helpful when it's formalized, but sometimes you might not have that opportunity to have something that's super formalized and very clear. And so one thing that's really valuable for me is just having those informal connections or those support groups and identifying those people early on. These are people that are like-minded like me. They have similar passions, similar ambitions, similar desires, and we can leverage each other and support each other as we continue to grow in our careers. And I think that's just as important. And as a woman, I think that's one thing that I always look for going into a company. I'm thinking, okay, where are there other women like me, that I've seen in the past, that are just as passionate, just as driven? They're not afraid to say, you know what, I don't have all of the answers, but let me leverage other people in my network. And so that's been pretty valuable and helpful for me.
Fantastic, thank you. So my next question is around looking at the data. As a data analyst, I love looking at numbers, and we've seen a trend in the last few years of companies being more transparent about their representation data and other inclusion-related information. They're participating in programs such as AnitaB.org's Top Companies program. How important do you think it is for companies to be sharing this data, and what does looking at that publicly really mean for you? How do you interpret that as a woman technologist?
I think that sharing the data, publicly is one thing, but I think more importantly, the issue first is starting to measure it, and then also starting to measure it in a way that is consistent throughout organizations. I think that participating in something like Top Companies really sets the standard for how are other organizations considering the number of women who are starting out in entry-level positions and their rates of promotion or rates of separation from a company. And I think that once the first thing you have to do is start measuring something, and then you can start to introspect and think about it in a different way.
One thing I've really appreciated about companies sharing their numbers is owning up to the fact that they're not all the way there yet. The numbers don't look great. Pretty much none of the companies out there in tech have fantastic numbers. And admitting that is the first step to fixing it, admitting that we're not all the way there yet, and rather than pretending like things are fixed, showing the growth areas that we have so that we can start working on them together.
And just to add on to that, I think the beauty of a lot of companies now, after this data is being out there, is that it's actually motivating them to put a lot of initiatives in place and follow up on whatever data that they're seeing and saying, okay, this is where the gap is. Let's make sure that we have resources there. Let's make sure that we have representation there. Let's make sure that we have executive leadership that is driving and owning that area, making sure that we don't have this gap next year when it's time for us to release that data again. And so I think that's the beauty of putting things out in the open, is that you're kind of held accountable to make sure that you solve whatever problem that is exposed.
Yeah, and then I think one last thing to add on to that is kind of like the retrospective, someone tried something, let's try something new, or let's see where it worked or where it didn't.
Yeah.
I think definitely in that same vein, one thing, going back to almost the internal sharing, is we look so often at just representation numbers, which are very important, but don't replace the inclusion and equity efforts that are also going on at these companies. And so making sure to pay attention to those as well. I think it can be really easy to say the public number is the diversity and representation number, so that's what we're going to work on. And the inclusion is a little harder to measure. And so I think there's a tendency, especially for us, to gravitate towards the numbers and the things that we can measure and tangibly improve. So as long as we release those numbers, but also take a step back and say that they're not everything.
Great. Well, and I think building on that, we know the data is out there. It's really great to use that as one tool, but when you may be looking for a company to work for, or maybe talking to a fellow woman technologist about where they want to work, what are some things that you can also look for from a company beyond that data? Are there certain programs, policies, looking at number of women in leadership, maternity leave? Are there things that really stand out for you?
Yeah, I think one thing that has been really helpful for various other candidates as well as myself is talking to people in your role about what their experience has been. I mean, that seems like an obvious first step, but actually sitting down, having them introduce you to their ERGs and talking to those people as well, not just the people who are interviewing you, can be really helpful. And especially asking them, what are their managers like? Like, what is their manager training like? These sorts of things are really helpful because you see such different experiences often in companies across different teams. And so those sorts of regular policies and regular trainings can be really a signal of how well this company can support you.
I think one thing I also look for and I value are opportunities for me to continue to learn and grow and develop in my technical skills. I think that's one thing that really sets companies apart for me, especially at the company that I'm working at now. I knew that I wanted to join because they were solving this large, complex problem that that actually hasn't been solved before. And so I thought, well, this is a great way for me to learn on the job and continue to be mentored and, just be thrown into the fire and, break things and build them back up again. And so I think that's one thing that's helpful for me when I'm looking for a company is to see, okay, how large is the problem? How much exposure will I have to solving that problem? And then that helps me to be an owner and a partial stakeholder on whatever solution that we might bring about.
Yeah. I think it certainly helps to be able to ask people in my network who work there to know what their experiences have been and also look at what the companies are publishing about their culture on their website or their careers page because certainly sometimes I might not want to necessarily out myself as a mom by asking about their maternity benefits. And so I think it's important for companies to put that information out there. But if I have access to a woman or a member of an employee resource group, asking them, do they feel like anything has changed as a result of their feedback? Do they feel like they're being listened to, and how included do they feel in the larger conversation?
Fantastic. I think those are some really good things to look at as you're joining a company. But the data tells us that there are actually quite a few women entering at the entry level, but most of them are leaving the tech workforce by mid-career. Women are leaving their companies at higher rates than men. What are some things that you've experienced or maybe you've heard of that are really good ways that would keep you at a company? Some good retention ideas.
I think in one particular situation around women leaving the workforce after having babies, I think it's really important that a company have a plan for like, look, here's how planning for leave works, here's how returning from leave works, putting the information out there so that women know what they're coming back to and know that their manager has thought about these things and has empathy for their situation.
One thing that I've actually found that's been really impactful is actually having really solid HR. Feeling like you have that support network and like the company is advocating for you is very, very important. And just realizing that those people are there and that if you're having trouble with your manager or with your team or with another employee, that there's somebody who will actually listen and care and change something if it's not working can be really impactful.
I did just want to ask a follow-up question there. Having good HR can be so helpful, but from some stories we've seen in the news lately, not every company has a helpful HR team. Are there some things that you kind of noticed about your HR team that made it clear that they were there to support you?
Yeah, I think one thing that's been the most helpful, we have every employee is paired with an HR partner. And this partner is actually someone who's pretty consistently there, so you see the same person when you talk to them. And they also have been very good about asking you if they want you to, if you want them to share what you're telling them. So they've made it clear you can go to them to just talk through some personnel issue you're having, and they're not going to share it unless you tell them to. And so I think that's really important. I've felt like I can go to them and say, I'm dealing with this situation. I would like advice about how to handle it. And that doesn't necessarily mean I'm escalating or being a tattletale or whatever you might think it would feel like. And so it just feels a little bit more like a support system than it could otherwise.
And I think what you said there, like everyone is paired with someone, means that like maybe you have a relationship with your business partner before you need to talk to them?
Yes, definitely. They try to like proactively get to know people ahead of time. So it's not just you're going to them with problems. This is actually someone that you get to know pretty well.
Great. Well, we actually have a few minutes left here. I'd love to take some questions from the audience if anyone has some questions to ask.
There's someone back
In the back?
Do we have a mic?
What's the toughest question that you would want to ask an interviewer?
Just to repeat the question, what's the toughest question you would want to ask an interviewer?
So this is someone that's interviewing me, right? Okay, I think the toughest question I would want to ask is, if I have an opinion that is contrary to the mission or the goal, how would that be received on that team? And this just helps me to understand, well, are they receptive to different opinions? Because leadership looks different. You don't always have to be the vocal person in the room. Maybe you're more quiet, or maybe you're a little bit more bashful, or maybe you're a little bit more reserved. Maybe you're a person who likes to go back and think and then come back and present with facts and data. And so one thing I would probably try to press on with my interviewer is, how do you receive and take different opinions or contrary positions, opinions rather, if it doesn't, if it's different from the overall goal.
Yeah. I think I might say, like, tell me about a time when you or your organization changed its mind about a policy around inclusion.
That's a good one. I think one question I'd ask is, what sorts of bonding does your team do? What sorts of offsites, if they do any? I think one signal often of a good culture is they do things that are not in the evenings or drinking related or all of these like sort of taboo, non-inclusive offsite ideas. And so asking them, what was your last offsite, can often give you a pretty good signal into that.
That's along those lines. One interesting piece of advice I had gotten was to take a look in the fridge whenever you're interviewing, so you can kind of see, like, are there a bunch of beers in there? What's going on? And get some insight into company culture.
Definitely.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Yeah, they're in the back.
Hello. As a woman in engineering, I'm definitely in the minority at my company. But what I have found is that a lot of the women at my company who are advocating for change are very focused on a single dimension of diversity, and there's a very serious lack of discussion around intersectionality for trans women and non-binary folks, for queer women, for women of color, for women with disabilities. How do you help shape that conversation when people really just want to focus on one very small group of women?
I would say see if there's a way for there to be more than one program, or more than one initiative, or if metrics in a time box can be like when they can say mission accomplished and now try do something else. Sharing articles, I think a big conversation like in the very early on days of Awesome Women in Engineering was around like being able to have a conversation to educate others about like what is internalized sexism and what does it mean to include a woman who is different than you in some way and recognize like her needs and goals as being the same as yours at the end of the day. We all want to be happy and feel included at work.
I think one thing that's I've also found to be helpful is getting input from all of the people at the company. So it's often you'll have the people who someone knows will be invited to be in the room for these sorts of discussions and decisions. And so including more people in that conversation and more people's opinions, even if they're not all in the room, sending out surveys for feedback, doing focus groups, various different ways of soliciting those perspectives from other people in the company can help you get diverse perspectives in your initiatives.
And also just leveraging allies. I think that's one thing that people overlook sometimes, just understanding that there's other people as well that are just as passionate and also want to be partners and stakeholders in your overall objective. And so just leveraging them a little bit more is helpful.
Great, yeah, and I think another thing going back to what we mentioned a little bit earlier about measurement, when you start measuring things, that's when you really start looking at it. So I think if you're seeing your organization focus in too much, it might be great to talk to them about ways they could expand what they're looking at and use that as a driver for expanding focus. Are there any other questions from the audience? I do have one that I would like to ask you guys. Oh, was there a question? Oh, great. Sorry.
Thank you. So sometime back, I left the workforce and came back to work. During that time, I found it really difficult to find opportunities. So I would be interested in understanding what are your organizations doing to kind of look at such candidates and help them. What's your company doing?
I think we try and do interviews that start, like in the engineering organizations, interviews that start with coding challenges as opposed to starting with a resume screen, starting off on the merit of your work, and we specifically don't have a problem with gaps.
I think one thing that we've been doing is doing more not just coding interviews. So we do interviews where we actually talk about work, how you would approach various situations, how you are as an employee is not just how you answer a coding challenge. And so I think expanding what we're asking and how we're deciding has been helpful.
I think that's quite difficult because I haven't seen that being solved actually, but I can bring an example from my community of women outside of my workplace, especially in the Hackbright community. I went to a baby shower a couple weekends ago, and ironically, it started off talking about work-life balance, and then the conversation started to go into coaching through certain type of interviewing for a sales engineering role at a specific company. And so I think that's one thing that could help women who might be out of the workplace for a little bit longer, if there are people that you can leverage to coach you through every step of the interview process, even from the technical screening or the talk with the recruiter, and how to manage all those soft skills are incredibly helpful. So I don't know if that's an avenue for you, but if you can leverage people in your community or your network to coach you through the interview process, that would really help.
Thank you so much, and I would like to request everybody in this room, if you are in a position to recruit ever, and if you find a candidate with a break in the resume, for instance, it's very personal to me because I came to the workforce with about a gap of like 10 to 11 months, and it was difficult for recruiters to even get me an interview. They were like, oh, currently you're jobless? That was the reaction that I had to kind of overcome. So it's a request to everyone in this room to kind of consider such candidates as well. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, I think that's what we're here to talk about today, is that we need to kind of expand the way we're looking at the ideal technologist and what that really looks like. So unfortunately, we are out of time today, so please give our panelists a big round of applause, and thank you for joining us.